They said it was just a fee, a few $100s, buried in paperwork, quietly stacked up late charges until it snowballed into a threat. But when the homeowner didn't bend, the HOA made a decision no one thought possible, sending bulldozers to level a mountain mansion that had stood for years, erasing a family's pride and history in a single afternoon. Neighbors watched in disbelief as power and greed crushed more than concrete. It crushed trust. But what the HOA never expected was that this act of destruction would ignite a fire that could dismantle their entire district. So how does one homeowner's loss become the downfall of an entire HOA empire? At first glance, life on the mountain ridge looked like a dream. A winding road led to a quiet gated community, where massive homes stood like fortresses, overlooking valleys of green and sky so wide it felt endless. Among them sat one mansion that always caught the eye, an architectural gem, built with years of sacrifice, late nights, and steady saving. It wasn't just a house. It was the kind of home that carried pride in every brick, every beam, every view from its windows. The family who lived there had worked for everything they owned. Long hours, hard jobs, and years of struggle had finally turned into stability. Their children grew up running across open decks, chasing mountain breezes, and playing basketball in a driveway wide enough to gather the whole neighborhood. Friends and family visited often, drawn by the warmth and laughter that echoed through the halls. For a while, it seemed untouchable, an American dream, carved into stone and wood dot. But underneath the beauty of that community ran another force, quiet yet powerful: the Homeowners Association. It was meant to keep the neighborhood tidy, to preserve property values, to make sure things looked right. But as many who've lived under HOA control know, rules have a way of twisting. What starts as a fine for weeds can become a $1,000 penalty for unimproved paint. A reminder to pay dues can morph into threats of liens and foreclosures. And when power falls into the wrong hands, the HOA becomes less about community and more about control. At first, the family barely noticed the letters. Small notices tucked under their door. A reminder about fees. A warning about deadlines. Easy to overlook when life was full of bigger things. But with each envelope came a sharper tone, each message layered with the suggestion that something was brewing. Something that could turn their dream home into the center of a nightmare. And it all began with a single line on a piece of paper, an unpaid balance that no one in the family even knew existed. The first sign that something wasn't right came in the form of a thin cream-colored envelope. It was stamped with the HOA's seal and emblem that looked official, almost governmental, as if it carried authority no one could question. Inside was a short letter claiming that the family owed delinquent fees, totaling just under $500. No breakdown, no details, just a balance due. At first, they thought it was a mistake. After all, they'd been paying on time every quarter since moving into the community. Surely, it was just an error in the system. But the HOA didn't see it that way. Within weeks, another letter arrived, this one sharper in tone. Failure to pay will result in further action. It read in bold type. Attached to it was a late fee, another $100. By the third letter, the balance had doubled, with threats of legal action scribbled in red ink. What had started as a minor discrepancy was snowballing into something darker, something that felt less like bookkeeping and more like an attack. The family called, emailed, and even sent certified mail asking for records of what they supposedly owed. Every request was ignored. Instead, new notices appeared, slipped under the door, taped to the garage, delivered in stacks like a constant reminder of the noose tightening around their property. Neighbors started whispering, "Did you hear they're not paying their dues?" "I thought they were doing well, guess not." The HOA didn't just control the streets and sidewalks. They controlled perception. And once that narrative spread, that a homeowner was a deadbeat or delinquent, it stuck. The tension bled into everyday life. The kids stopped inviting friends over, embarrassed by the papers taped to the door. The father began losing sleep, checking the mailbox at odd hours like he was bracing for an ambush. The mother, who had worked so hard to turn the house into a sanctuary, now felt the walls closing in. Their home, once a refuge, was becoming a prison surrounded by rules they never agreed to and penalties they never earned. Then came the fines. It started with grass. The HOA claimed the family's lawn was non-compliant, even though it was mowed weekly, green and lush like every other yard on the block. A $200 fine appeared, attached to the already disputed fees. Days later, another notice arrived, this time about improper trash can placement. The cans, they said, had been visible for more than 12 hours after collection. Another $150. The absurdity piled higher with every envelope. A decorative wreath on the front door, $75 violation. Basketball hoop in the driveway, $100 violation. A car parked slightly over the sidewalk, $250 violation. It was a flood of harassment disguised as governance. And every violation came with a warning: pay now or risk further action. The family tried to push back, attending an HOA meeting to plead their case. But the room was stacked against them. The board, made up of a small group of retirees and power-hungry residents, shut down every question. Rules are rules, they said. If you don't like it, maybe this isn't the right community for you. Walking out of that meeting, the father realized something chilling. The HOA didn't want their money. They wanted their house. The notices became more aggressive. Certified letters warned of liens, legal fees, and the possibility of foreclosure. Yes, foreclosure. The HOA had the legal power to seize property over unpaid dues, no matter how questionable the charges were. And they weren't afraid to wield that power like a weapon. The family's once solid world began to fracture. Creditors called, collection letters piled up, and the stress weighed heavily on their shoulders. But what the HOA didn't know was that beneath the surface of fear, something else was brewing. Anger. The father started documenting everything, taking photos of the lawn, recording every phone call, saving every envelope. The mother dug into the HOA's bylaws, highlighting inconsistencies and outdated clauses. Together, they were quietly building a case, even as the walls of harassment closed in tighter. And the HOA made its boldest move yet. One evening, the family returned home to find a bright orange notice nailed to their front door. It read, "Final warning. Failure to comply will result in immediate legal action, including foreclosure proceedings." The language was blunt, cold, and final. It wasn't a threat anymore. It was a promise. The children cried, asking if they'd have to leave their home. The parents reassured them, but deep down, they weren't sure. The mansion on the mountain, once a symbol of stability and triumph, now hung by a thread. The neighbors' whispers grew louder. Some crossed the street to avoid eye contact. Others offered pitying glances that cut just as deep. The family wasn't just battling the HOA, they were being socially isolated, turned into pariahs in the very place they had built their dream. And then, one night, it all came to a head. As the family sat at dinner, headlights swept across the driveway. A tow truck pulled up, backing toward one of their cars. Startled, the father rushed outside, demanding an explanation. The driver shoved a clipboard at him in order, signed by this HOA to repossess the vehicle over unpaid community fees. It was the breaking point. Watching their car lifted onto the truck, the family realized this wasn't about fees or compliance anymore. It was about power. The HOA was flexing its control, making an example of them, showing every resident what happened when you dared to resist. The father clenched his fists, his anger no longer something he could swallow. The mother's eyes narrowed with a determination that cut sharper than fear. Together, they knew this wasn't the end. This was the beginning of a fight. And as they stood under the harsh glare of the tow truck's lights, one thought crystallized in their minds. The HOA had gone too far. But the HOA had underestimated something crucial. The family wasn't powerless. They weren't alone. And behind the curtain of harassment and intimidation, the seeds of revenge were already taking root. What the HOA didn't know was that this family had resources, connections, and a willingness to fight fire with fire. And the board members who thought they held all the cards were about to face a storm they never saw coming. The morning of the hearing arrived like a storm cloud that refused to lift. For weeks, the family had been battered by fines, violations, and the humiliation of watching their car dragged away like some public shaming ritual. But now, everything came down to this day. The HOA had filed for foreclosure, demanding payment not only for the alleged dues, but also for thousands in legal fees and administrative costs. If the board got its way, the family's dream home would no longer be theirs. It would be sold off at auction, a prize taken by the very people who had tormented them. The courthouse steps felt heavier than lead. Neighbors showed up, some out of curiosity, others out of loyalty to the HOA. The board members strutted like victors before the verdict, smug in their tailored suits, their confidence radiating like a challenge. We win. You lose, always. But this time, the family wasn't alone. Behind them walked a figure the HOA hadn't expected. The aunt. She was a lawyer, sharp-eyed, sharp-witted, and known for dismantling opponents with surgical precision. She had stayed quiet during the early stages, advising patients, urging her family to build their evidence carefully. But today, silence ended. Today, she was their weapon. The hearing room filled with the kind of tension that makes every breath feel like a battle. The judge entered, stern but fair. The HOA's attorney wasted no time painting the family as negligent, irresponsible, and delinquent. Charts, spreadsheets, and binders were paraded forward, each one bloated with numbers that supposedly proved the family owed tens of thousands of dollars. The room buzzed with judgment. Neighbors nodded along, convinced the family had been lying all along. The board members smirked, satisfied that their narrative was sticking. But then the aunt rose, calm, measured, her voice cut through the air like steel wrapped in velvet. She didn't start with excuses. She started with facts. Out came the stack of meticulously documented records, the very envelopes, notices, and recordings the family had saved. She laid them on the table one by one, each piece of evidence like a strike of lightning against the HOA story. She showed how the fees had mysteriously multiplied without explanation, how fines were inconsistently applied, how the board had weaponized outdated bylaws to target one household while ignoring others. Photos of neatly mowed lawns countered claims of neglect. Time-stamped videos showed trash cans moved well within the allowed time frame. Witness statements revealed that other families had basketball hoops and wreaths, but none were fined. What had seemed like a tidy case for the HOA began unraveling, thread by thread. The judge leaned forward. The smirks on the board's faces began to falter. And then came the bombshell. The aunt revealed bank records obtained through discovery. These records showed that the legal fees and administrative costs weren't being funneled into community maintenance at all. They were being funneled into personal accounts, vacation homes, luxury cars, even a private fund for board members. The HOA wasn't just overstepping. They were embezzling. The room gasped. Neighbors whispered, eyes widening as they realized they'd been deceived, not by the family, but by the very people claiming to protect the community. The HOA's attorney stammered, flipping through papers that suddenly looked worthless. The board members' confidence collapsed, replaced by panic. Beads of sweat trickled down their foreheads. Their empire of control was crumbling in real time. The judge's gavel struck once, sharp and final. "Enough," he declared. The evidence was overwhelming. Not only were the foreclosure proceedings dismissed, but an investigation into the HOA board was formally announced. For the first time in months, the family felt the weight lift from their shoulders. They hadn't just defended their home, they'd exposed a system of corruption that had bullied countless neighbors into silence. But the climax didn't end there. The news spread like wildfire. Local reporters swarmed the courthouse, cameras flashing, microphones pushed forward. Neighbors who had once whispered behind closed doors now rallied, their voices rising in anger against the HOA. How could they do this to us? We've been paying all this time for what? The board members, once untouchable in their authority, were suddenly hounded. Their names splashed across headlines, their reputations shredded. The president of the HOA tried to escape through the back exit, but reporters and furious residents blocked the path. His arrogance had evaporated, leaving only fear. In that moment, the family wasn't just a victim anymore. They were the symbol of resistance. The ones who had dared to stand up, who had pulled back the curtain to reveal the truth. The father clenched his fists, not in anger this time, but in triumph. The mother, who had carried her children through nights of tears and uncertainty, held her head high, her eyes fierce with pride. The children, once silenced by shame, now smiled with relief, knowing they wouldn't have to leave their home after all. Still, the fight wasn't entirely over. The aunt warned that investigations take time, that the board would try to claw back whatever power they could. And the family knew this battle had left scars. Trust had been broken. Friendships had been tested. The illusion of community had been shattered. But for the first time in a long time, the balance of power had shifted. The HOA was on defense. And the family? They were on offense. The courtroom drama had delivered its blow. But the real question hung heavy in the air. What would happen to the board now that the world knew the truth? Would they face jail time? Would the HOA collapse entirely? Would the community finally see justice after years of silent suffering? One thing was certain. This fight had changed everything. And as the family walked out of the courthouse, surrounded by flashing cameras and a sea of angry neighbors, the aunt whispered just one line. "This isn't the end. It's just the beginning of their downfall." The weeks that followed the courtroom showdown unfolded like a slow but steady earthquake. For years, the HOA board had walked through the neighborhood with their heads high, dictating every detail of their neighbors' lives, what color curtains they could hang, how tall their grass could grow, even how long a car could sit in a driveway. But after the court hearing, that illusion of authority was shattered. At first, there was shock. Neighbors who had paid fines without question suddenly demanded refunds. Families who had lived under the constant fear of letters and violations began digging through their mailboxes, pulling out old notices that suddenly looked like evidence of fraud. And whispers turned into shouts, angry residents calling each other late into the night, sharing stories of intimidation, harassment, and years of unfair treatment. The board members could no longer hide behind their polished veneer. The HOA president, once seen strutting confidently across manicured lawns, now avoided eye contact in public. He stopped attending community events, too ashamed or too frightened to face the people he'd spent years controlling. His once proud house, perched at the end of the cul-de-sac, became a target of ridicule. Where neighbors had once looked at it with envy, now they shook their heads in disgust. The community meetings, once stifling affairs where residents dared not challenge the board, became fiery gatherings. People stood up, voices trembling with pent-up anger, recounting the fines, the fees, and the humiliation they had endured. And with every testimony, the outrage grew. The HOA wasn't just accused of overreach. It was accused of theft, deception, and betrayal of trust. The aunt, sharp as ever, didn't let the momentum fade. She helped organize a petition to remove the board entirely, rallying neighbors who had once felt powerless. Within days, the required signatures were collected. The board members tried to resist, citing bylaws and procedures, but no one was listening anymore. Their authority had evaporated, replaced by the collective fury of a community that had finally woken up. When the removal vote was held, it wasn't close. Nearly every household voted to oust the board. The result was unanimous enough to feel like a verdict from the people themselves. And just like that, the once powerful leaders of the HOA were stripped of their titles. But the downfall didn't stop there. The financial investigation, sparked by the aunt's revelations in court, uncovered years of misappropriated funds. Luxury vacations billed as board retreats, home renovations disguised as maintenance expenses, even private credit card charges hidden in vague budget line items. The scheme was bigger than anyone had imagined, and as the evidence piled up, so did the consequences. The HOA president and treasurer were indicted on charges of embezzlement and fraud. News crews swarmed the neighborhood, capturing images of them being escorted out in handcuffs. The very people who had once bullied families over mailbox, paint colors were now splashed across evening news broadcasts as criminals. The neighbors gathered on their porches to watch as police cars pulled away, their red and blue lights flashing against the suburban streets. For many, it was a moment of vindication, a living reminder that power, no matter how petty, is never absolute when truth comes to light. For the family at the center of it all, life slowly began to return to normal. A constant knot in their stomachs loosened. The father no longer dreaded checking the mailbox. The mother no longer worried about her children, overhearing arguments about fines they couldn't afford. The children, once embarrassed to invite friends over, now held their heads high, proud to know their family had stood up to injustice. But more than anything, the family realized they weren't alone anymore. Where once they had felt isolated, now they were surrounded by neighbors who admired their courage. They became the face of resistance, the ones who had fought back when everyone else felt helpless. Block parties, long absent under the rigid rule of the HOA, returned. Families gathered in driveways, sharing food and laughter without fear of being told they were violating bylaws. Basketball hoops reappeared on sidewalks. Holiday decorations glowed brighter than ever. It wasn't just about reclaiming space, it was about reclaiming freedom. The aunt, though proud of her family, reminded them that justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about rebuilding trust, about creating a community where neighbors worked together instead of tearing each other apart. With her guidance, a new interim HOA board was formed, not one driven by greed or control, but one focused on transparency and fairness. Monthly budgets were posted publicly. Decisions were made in open forums where every voice could be heard. The neighborhood, once fractured, began to heal. The story didn't just end within the cul-de-sac. News outlets across the state covered the scandal, turning it into a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked HOA power. Lawmakers began discussing reforms, citing the case as evidence that homeowners deserved stronger protections. The family watched all this unfold with a mix of pride and humility. They had never asked to be leaders, never sought the spotlight. They just wanted to live in peace, in the home they had worked so hard to build. But life has a way of pushing ordinary people into extraordinary battles. And when pushed, they hadn't backed down. Looking back, the father remembered the night they first got the foreclosure notice, the crushing weight of defeat pressing down on him. He thought the fight was hopeless then. But now, standing on his porch, watching his kids play freely under the evening sky, he realized something profound. Sometimes the darkest battles bring out the brightest victories. The mother, too, reflected on the journey. She remembered the humiliation of watching the tow truck drag their car away, the sting of neighbors' judgment in those early days. But now, when she walked through the community, those same neighbors stopped to thank her, to tell her she'd inspired them to never let fear silence their voices again. The children, though young, carried their own lesson. That standing up for what's right, even when it feels impossible, can change everything. As for the aunt, she returned to her law practice, but not without leaving her family with a parting reminder. Power isn't in the hands of those who shout the loudest. It's in the hands of those who refuse to be silenced. The scandal faded in time, as all scandals do, but the lessons remained. The neighborhood, once a place of control and fear, was now a place of unity and resilience. And the family, once nearly driven out of their home, had become the symbol of justice delivered. The story ended not with a bang of revenge, but with the quiet satisfaction of knowing the truth had won. The corrupt had fallen, the innocent had prevailed, and the community had been forever changed. And so the final takeaway was simple yet powerful. When ordinary people stand up to injustice, even the mightiest of bullies can fall. Because at the end of the day, this wasn't just a story about an HOA. It was a story about power, courage, and the unshakable belief that home should be a place of safety, not fear. And for those who had ever been bullied by petty rules or unfair authority, it left one lingering question. If they came after you, would you have the courage to fight back too? This was today's secret. Every shed hides a secret, but remember, the shed never stays quiet for long. Until next time, Secret Shed Stories.